The moment they broke through that sealed door, the excavation leader's canary died, and so did everyone else who entered, one by one. November 4th, 1922. Howard Carter stood in the Valley of the Kings with his patron, Lord Carnarvon, staring at a wall of stone that hadn't been disturbed in over 3,000 years. The air was thick, ancient. When they finally breached it, when they finally saw gold glinting in the darkness, something shifted. I've read the expedition journals myself. The mood changed. Within weeks, Lord Carnarvon was dead. Pneumonia, they said, but the newspapers had already started whispering about the curse. But here's what nobody talks about. Tutankhamun wasn't European royalty, he was Egyptian. Yet this story, this cursed narrative, became the obsession of Western newspapers for decades. The scandal wasn't the deaths themselves, it was how the press weaponized them. Every illness, every accident, every coincidence became proof of ancient vengeance. And the people who actually died, their names got buried under the mythology. Let me back up. Tutankhamun died around 1323 BCE, a teenage king probably murdered, though we still don't know for certain. For 3,000 years, his tomb sat undisturbed beneath the sand. Then in the early 1920s, Carter, a meticulous Englishman with decades of dig experience, finally found it. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't looting. He was doing archaeology. Carnarvon was a wealthy British aristocrat, the kind of man who funded digs the way other men collected art. He was also chronically ill, weak lungs, recurrent infections. When he arrived in Egypt for the opening, he was already fragile. The tomb was dusty, cramped, full of mold spores that had been sealed for millennia. Within weeks of the excavation, he nicked himself shaving, got an infection, and developed pneumonia. He died on April 5, 1923. The press exploded. Lord Carnarvon falls to mummy's curse, the headline screamed. His death was real, tragic, but it wasn't mystical. It was just infection in an age before antibiotics. Yet the narrative had taken root. Every death connected to the excavation became evidence. Here's where it gets interesting and where my skepticism kicks in. Over the next 30 years, roughly 20 people connected to the excavation died. Sounds damning, right? Except here's the problem. Most of them died of natural causes decades later. One archaeologist lived another 30 years. Another made it to 96. Howard Carter himself, the man who actually spent months inside that tomb breathing the air, he lived to 84. But the narrative sold papers, and it still does. The curse became bigger than the actual discovery. The actual science got buried. What we should be talking about is what was inside that tomb, the wealth of knowledge about how a young pharaoh lived, what he wore, what he ate. Instead, we got ghost stories. Now there was one genuinely unsettling detail. Carter's canary, a yellow bird he kept in his Cairo home, died the day the tomb was opened. The local workers saw it as a terrible omen. The death of the pharaoh's yellow bird, they called it. And yes, it's eerie, but canaries die. They are fragile creatures. In the heat of Egypt, in a colonial household, it's not remarkable. But the press didn't care about probability. They cared about circulation. And here's the scandal that actually matters. The British media used the curse narrative to justify why Egypt's cultural treasures belonged in London museums, not Cairo. If the tomb was dangerous, cursed, well, then Western scholars had to protect it. They had to control it. The real story isn't about supernatural revenge. It's about how Western institutions used superstition and fear to justify the theft of non-Western cultural property. The curse was never the story. The colonialism was. What actually killed Lord Carnarvon wasn't Tutankhamun's wrath. It was a bacterial infection. What actually killed some of the other men was age, disease, and the simple fact that people die. The tomb, it contained a teenage boy's belongings. Sacred, priceless, historically invaluable, but not lethal. The curse persists in popular culture because it's a better story than the truth. And here's what troubles me most. We still do this. We still let narratives override evidence. We still prefer mystery to facts. We still let sensationalism bury scholarship. Howard Carter spent his life studying Tutankhamun. He published meticulous documentation. He preserved knowledge. And yet his name is remembered first for a curse he didn't believe in. That's the real tragedy. the erasure of rigorous work under layers of mythology. So when you hear about the curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, remember this: it wasn't a curse. It was a story told by people who needed it to be more interesting than what it actually was. And that story had power. It shaped how we thought about Egypt, about archaeology, about ancient cultures themselves. The deaths were real, the grief was real, but the curse, that was journalism. And the consequences of that journalism, the way it reframed a nation's history through the lens of Western fear and superstition, those consequences lasted far longer than any curse ever could. This is the pattern throughout history. Take a fact, wrap it in mythology, repeat it until everyone believes it, and by then the original truth is so buried you'd need an archaeologist to find it, which, I suppose, is fitting. Subscribe. Every week we uncover the real story behind history's most famous myths.